So it's a little past 1, it's Division 2, and we'll open the meeting with the Department of Education. And please introduce yourself.
My name is Mark Manganello with the Department of Education, Bureau of School Finance. Today, the focus is adequacy. You have a couple of documents in front of you. You have the orientation package that we provided on January 13th. If you already have this, I plan on just using this as a reference if you want to discuss this today, because we didn't cover all 33 pages in here. So if we want to refer back to it, we can. If you already have a copy, you can just pass it off to Mickey, and it'll just be around for someone to pick up. The other document here, you already have this from the January 13th training. However, I've highlighted a few communities, and we're just going to walk through this spreadsheet because we did not do that back in January. The new documents we have excess swept documents. So we're going to dig into that a little bit. You have a handout, a town by town of the excess swept communities. And then you have a sort of hypothetical walkthrough of what's going to happen if excess swept becomes the law of the land via the RAND issue that's currently in the Supreme Court. And we'll talk about how that would impact communities using these tools. Just to step back a little bit before we talk about adequacy, I think just spending some time in the Education Funding Committee room, seeing some themes as far as what issues might make their way to D2, seeing a lot of swept bills. So going through swept today, I think is going to be helpful. If you do have some swept bills that make it into this committee. Other issues, we're seeing a lot of nutrition program bills. We're seeing EFA bills. We're seeing special education bills in that committee. So you're gonna have a chance to learn some of the new members or people not used to digging into the details with education funding. Those are just some of the themes we're seeing in that committee. So getting a baseline understanding today and this week would be helpful. So we're just gonna walk through the formula for 3 towns. We have Albany, Allenstown, and Alton. So Albany and Allenstown are pretty similar. They're not excess swept communities, but we're just going to walk through their data. And then Alton is an excess swept community, and we're going to be talking about that. So the adequacy formula, as most of you know, and if you've received this training, the formula, it does change every year, but a lot of it stays the same. So we have Albany, Allenstown, and Alton highlighted there. The first column is their membership. As we've discussed before, as most of you know, membership is the town responsible for educating that student. So if Albany has students that are receiving a home education and are not the responsibility of the district, they're not part of their membership. If they have students going to a non-public school that the district's not paying for, sometimes the district can pay to send your kid to a student to a non-public school. Whatever it may be, if the student is not part of the district, they're not part of the membership. So it's who are the students that Albany is responsible for educating. And Albany doesn't run any schools, they actually tuition students out. However, they are responsible for educating those students who live in that district. And that's what we're measuring there is average daily membership and residence. So they reside in Albany, they reside in Allenstown, they reside in Alton. Allenstown's another example. They send their students to Pembroke. So their ADMR, these 503 students are what they're responsible, but they're sending students to Pembroke. So that's the first measurement, and that's just how we measure students for the adequacy formula.
You might explain how you got an eight tenths of a student.
Yes. So that's the average daily membership part. So we are looking at a student. We're looking at a student throughout the full school year, and adequacy is 1 year behind. So we would look at school year 24, 25 and we use that data for fiscal year 26. It's average daily membership and daily membership. So we're looking at a student's full school year. So for school year 24-25, we estimate that there's going to be 57.8 students. And that's just a matter of applying percentages and coming up with an estimate. But you can have 57.8 students because if a student was there for 4/5 of the year, they would be 0.8 of a student. And so what we're doing is we have a data collection from the school districts. They tell us, at the end of the year, they told us who was there at the first day of school and who was there at the last day of school. And if you're there the first day of school and the last day of school, you're 1 student. If you were there for the first day, it's 180 days. You were there for 90 days, and you weren't there for the next 90 days, your 0.5 student. So that's how we're doing that measurement. Whenever you're trying to write education law, it's always important to remember, how are you going to define student? One of the first things you have to decide is, is it going to be a snapshot count? Are you going to say October 1st, let's look at where these students are, which is data we do collect, or are you going to look at the full school year? Also, when you're defining student, you want to think about what grade levels, ages, all these other metrics as well. But average daily membership or enrollment, sometimes we use them interchangeably, but in the law, you do need to be specific in how you use those terms. So we're tallying up all those students, getting the average daily membership and residence, and then we're multiplying it by something called base adequacy aid. So that is a metric. So one student is worth $4,265.64. For Albany, we're going to take 57.8 students and we're going to multiply it by the 4,265, and we're going to get $246,554. So that is base adequacy aid. And now, if you're curious about the history of base adequacy aid, Representative Bean was discussing about a little bit about the history before we started the committee meeting. A lot of this history, some of it's legislative, some of it happened in this room. A lot of it happened in this room. But to understand some of the rationale for this, you'd have to read the 2008 committee report. It was a legislative report to study how they would address adequacy. And so there's a 2008 report where they basically looked at teacher salaries. They looked at what they think would comprise an adequate education, and then they started assigning costs to it. And so they went through that exercise of thinking, what do we think, what kind of teachers do we want to have in a school? What kind of principals, guidance counselors, et cetera. And they come up with this methodology. And then they divided it by the number of students they'd expect those resources to educate. And so they came up with a number. This was in 2008. They came up with a number of, I think it was like $3,455. So that was a number they came back up with back then based on that report. Of course, if you, we've discussed this, but there's that number, this $4,265 number, and as well as that 2008 number of 3,455 or whatever it was exactly, that is being litigated. So it was litigated in Conval in 2019. It's still being litigated in Conval. And essentially what the school districts who have sued the state have said, that number doesn't provide an adequate education. And there's been multiple court hearings and some back and forth to the Supreme Court, back to the Superior Court. But right now it's being litigated. And so the latest order from a Superior Court, not the Supreme Court, is that number should be $7,356. And that was a trial that took place in the spring of 2023. The order came out, I believe, last fall. Now it's in the Supreme Court's hands. So the Supreme Court is now going to decide, is that number, that 7,356 number, is that number, whatever, we don't know what they're going to do, but they're going to look at that number. So as far as how this came up with, there was that 2008 report that came up with a study, that came up with a number, and then state law plugged that number right into state statute. So that's how we got here. And then there's a bunch of litigation to follow. That's still ongoing. So that's sort of where we're at with that number and where it exists. Yeah, you can certainly study up on that history. The next metric, besides base adequacy aid, and this goes back to that 2008 report, when they were studying adequacy and what it should be, there's a couple factors that the committee thought were important to provide additional funding. And in that 2008 report, they referenced poverty as something that requires extra funding. So they used free and reduced priced meals as the metric of poverty, and they decided to provide differential aid and extra money for educating those students. They also looked at special education, English language learner. There was also a third grade reading component that's now gone. So we don't need to go down that rabbit hole. But this is all back to that legislative history of 2008. So what lives today now is we provide additional aid for F&R students, which was also in that report, but also still in state law and in this formula. So for those Albany students, we are going to look at those 57.8 students, and then we are going to look at which students are free and reduced price meal eligible. And for each student that we can identify as free and reduced price meal eligible, we're going to multiply that by $2,392.92. So that one Albany student, you're getting base aid. You're also on top of that getting free and reduced price meals differential aid. So, to take that 4,200 plus the 2,300, that would be for one student that's FNR eligible. That would be the aid for that at a student level. That's how you would measure that aid. So when we do that for Albany, $77K, for Allenstown, $517K, and for Alton, $246K. The things with free and reduced price meals, this committee's received has talked about this a lot, is how do you identify those students? So there's two ways to identify them. There's the application. So a family fills out the application, and if they're within 185% of the federal poverty guideline, they are marked eligible, and they submit that data to the department, and then we know that that student filled out an application and was determined eligible. So there's filling out the application. The other way is direct certification. So if you are an individual who signed up for SNAP, these are DHHS entitlement programs, SNAP or TANF, a program that does have a means test to it, and you're determined eligible for that program, we have data sharing that's allowed. This is data sharing is regulated by the federal government, but it's allowed that we can pass SNAP data and TANF data from DHHS to the Department of Education, and we can identify those students as directly certified through that program. So if they did not fill out the application, we are still able to identify those students as FNR, and that's called direct certification. It can get a little complicated. Well, there's a little a wrinkle there as far as if you're 185% of the federal poverty guideline, you fill out the form. But with SNAP, there's a fiscal committee established a policy 2 years ago that you can be eligible for SNAP if you're 200% of the federal poverty guideline. So if you're 200% of the federal poverty guideline under SNAP, you can directly certify and still be eligible as FNR under this program. So that's generally it's 185 unless you're 200% and on SNAP. Then you would be determined FNR eligible. And the key thing to remember about that is that money is not meant to go to nutrition. That money is unrestricted money for your school. So that, 97.8 million statewide, it's not restricted to meals. It's not restricted to those students. It's unrestricted money to go to your school district. It's essentially targeting your school district as having extra needs, so you get extra money, but it doesn't go directly to a particular school with a high FNR count. It's unrestricted for the district. Moving on to special education aid, as differential aid. Same process if the student is in our Special Education Bureau database as having an IEP. We are going to match that student with their base adequacy amount, and we're going to provide them additional aid of $2,184.84 in special education aid. So that multiplied by that amount gets us, for Albany, gets us $36,426. For Allenstown, 106 students times that amount is $230K. And that's how special education differential aid works. Again, it's not restricted to those students. English language learner, same process if the student is an English language learner, which is a part of the Title III program it's a federally regulated program. If the student is an English language learner, we multiply those ADMRs, times those amounts right there, and we get English language learner aid. And so we're tallying this all up to get the cost of inadequate education. Cost of inadequate education, it's that base amount, that FNR differential aid, that special education differential aid, English language learner differential aid. There's some hidden columns here. I'll say one more thing. The recent law passed that now we always pay home education differential aid, essentially, which means if a student, it's not a lot of money, it's about $100,000 statewide, but if a student is home educated, so they're not enrolled in the district, they're not going to get a degree from their district because they're home educated, but they would like to take a course in their district, they are entitled to do that. And we will now collect class information on that student. and we'll basically convert that class information, that course information into an ADM and then compensate the school district. So statewide, that's not a lot of students. It's a few dozen students that do that. And so that's also part of the formula. It's just a tiny part of the formula. But we're tallying up all those students and we're getting the cost of an adequate education. And the way that works is essentially we've determined you need this amount under state law to provide an adequate education. But before we pay that, we're going to look at the SWEPT. And so what the SWEPT is essentially is the state needs to raise $363 million statewide. And so we look at the tax base, the entire state tax base, with excluding utilities, and it's about $300 billion. And we go, what are we going to need to tax every single community, 363 million over the entire SWEPT tax base, and it turns out to be a rate of about $1.12 per thousand. And so when we apply that tax rate of $1.12 per thousand to all of these communities, it raises an amount. And essentially that's community's share of the SWEPT. That community share of the 363 million is the way to think about it. And so for Albany, their share of the 363 million, or that essential rate of $1.12, it's an equalized rate. We can go into the weeds about why you don't pay $1.12, you pay something else because you don't pay an equalized rate, you pay an actual tax rate. We don't need to go in that right now. But Albany's share of that 363 million is 241K. So we look at the cost of an adequate education for Albany, it's 360K. We need to pay, we know that they have SWEPT of 241K going straight from their tax collector to their local treasurer and then to their school district. So we know the Albany School District has 241K raised from SWEPT. And so we're going to cut them a check for about 120,000. Because if we cut them a check for 120,000, which sometimes we call adequacy grants, we call it adequacy, I call it state cash because it's literally cash from the state to the district. So if we cut them a check for 120K, plus we know they're getting 241K from their SWEPT, we know that they're going to have 360K in funding to provide an adequate education as defined by the state. Same is true for Allenstown. Allenstown, their SWEPT revenue is 638K, but their cost of an adequate education is 2.9. So now we need to cut them a check of 2.2 million-ish to bring them up to the cost of an adequate education. The one difference here is when we talk about excess SWEPT. Alton is an excess SWEPT community. And so when we do the cost of an adequate education, we look at all the students in Alton and we tally that up. We get a cost of an adequate education of 2.7 million. When we look at their SWEPT, it's 4.1 million, or really 4.2 million. That SWEPT, all of that $4.2 million goes to Alton. So it goes from the Alton tax collector collects it and then sends it to the Alton school district. We don't need to cut a state check for Alton because we know they're getting $4.2 million and we know that $4.2 million covers the $2.7 million. So they have enough to cover an adequate education. Why it's called excess SWEPT is because it's above the cost of an adequate education. And so there's litigation, it's in the Supreme Court right now that's saying that state policy that Alton holds on to that 4.2 million and sends it to their school district, that a Superior Court judge ruled that state policy is unconstitutional. Certainly, there's litigation. There's parties that disagree. We can't. I think it's not helpful to debate whether that's the correct decision by the judge or not. That is the Supreme right now is in the Supreme Court hands. So the Supreme Court's going to decide if that is the correct policy of this interpretation of the Constitution. If they do say yes, the Superior Court ruled correctly, then at some point the Supreme Court would direct DRA to start collecting that excess SWEPT. So they would direct DRA in some way or some fashion, if this is what the order determines, that that extra, let's see, 1.5 million or so, I have it on this sheet. Yeah, 1.4 million. That extra 1.4 million now needs to go to the state, and that Alton is not able to hold on to that. Again, we don't know what the order is going to be. It could come out right as you're finishing your budget. Who knows? It's maybe might come out during the Senate phase. Who knows? But I want you to be aware of that issue because it might come out right as you're trying to wrap up your work. And we're going to go into more details about the how the mechanics of that is going to work if it does happen.
Representative Hopkins Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for answering this question. I'm not sure everybody on the committee knows the origin of the $363 million value first swept across the state. Could you give us kind of like a synopsis of where that value?
Yeah, I don't have the whole history memorized, but essentially, SWEPT was enacted in the 90s, late 90s. At one point, it was a rate. So the rate was frozen. And if property values grew, the revenue and the rate was frozen and property values grew, the more money would come in. Then I believe at some point, maybe it was the mid 2000s, they decided to freeze the dollar amount. So now if property values grew and the dollar amount was frozen, then the rate would decrease. So for the past several years, decades plus, the revenue has been frozen to 363. The property values have been growing and the rate has been decreasing. The history of that is, I think, around the time when they made that change, the rate was bringing in 363. So I think they just froze it to what it was currently funding. Good question.
Representative Weiler.
I think that was the money that was the big energy producers like Seabrook. They had a lot of money, so it was kind of equalizing it by putting it all in one thing and letting the state tax it. Basically, that was where the amount came from. But if they have 1.7 million or something excess in statewide education property tax, what I would ask Mr. Landrigan is if he could look up and see what other revenue they collect from the state. Let's say the highway block grant aid and the meals and rooms tax and all these other things that all the towns get a share of. And without adding a bunch of people to the employment, we already have the DRA has a municipal group that goes around and sets the tax rate in each town. They could also say, okay, this 1.7 million will become a credit against meals and rooms, distribution, highway block grant or whatever, so that I would call it, rather than a statewide property tax, a statewide balancing tax, so that we wouldn't hear the crying, oh, you took this money away from our town to give it to another town. Well, it'd be so complicated, nobody'd be able to figure it out, which is, you don't want it to be too simple, because then they say, you took $9 million away from us, or whatever it was. So that way, well, it varied. We gave you credit on this, we gave you credit on that, but not everything, because not only are we giving out $1 billion, but we're also giving out another 20 million in all these other taxes. And this, if we took all the excess in the statewide education property tax, it might be what, 9 million, I think we've heard. So yeah, it would be easy enough to do credits by the staff that comes around and sets the tax rate. And then it would all kind of be internal, and maybe we wouldn't hear as much lawsuits and crying anyway.
Yeah, the Department of Education has information as far as what Alton receives, and really it's or Prospect Mountain, or we have information about district funding. But you're right, as far as the LBA state aid database and the DRA would have more information about what the town receives. But yeah, we have some information we can provide relative to other state aid Alton would receive. But yeah, you'd have to dig a little deeper, and Mickey could help out as far
Is
as
that the biggest one, or is it Waterville Valley?
Well, I've got this sheet right here. This is the state aid, so we'll see who's the biggest one here. Rise up there. Maltonborough. Maltonborough is the biggest. Maltonborough has excess swept of 4.9 million.
Yeah.
Rye looks like it's number 2 with 3.1, and then a handful. And so, yeah, statewide, the total is 28.6 million. And this is, so essentially, if that order, we can dive into, while we're in it, let's dive into excess swept. I think this is helpful.
Yeah, that if there weren't, if there were other taxes that, or other distribution from the state, that this could become a credit, then it would in effect even things out.
Yeah, that amount statewide is 28.6. There's a lot of, some of the people want to know, you can look at see if your town's an excess swept town.
Representative Murray.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just for clarification, because perhaps I'm misunderstanding what Representative Weiler is suggesting, doesn't swept fund have to be used for educational purposes?
So there's, I always want to be careful because there's litigation going on about this. Effectively, that is what's happening for almost every single community. All of the large communities on here. There's litigation where if the swept is so large that it more than funds what you would even want to spend on education, then you get a negative local tax rate. And so that is also being litigated, whether that is allowed. In this sheet right here, there's a couple of unincorporated communities. Unincorporated communities have generally negative tax rates. But the large excess swept communities are taking that excess swept dollars and they're funding their school districts with it. So that would be, yeah, any large community on there is, they do not have negative local tax rates, and they're funding their education, like you said.
Representative Popovich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and again, thank you for being here. I just wanted to add one more concern that hasn't been expressed yet, which is that if we start dealing with excess swept where the municipality does need to send the money back to the state, that will create significant cash flow issues in towns because of the nature of the tax collection process versus the disbursement for the school district. So something like what Chairman Weiler was suggesting, I would say the major goal for that is to eliminate the friction in the system in terms of a town potentially needing to take a short-term loan to send the money to the state, only to get that money from the state a month later. All this movement of cash would be better if we can find a way to decrease it. It would just increase the efficiency in the government. So, I've been the finance director in Windham, and my God, a lot of my stress was around meeting cash flow. And this would exacerbate cash flow issues. Even for a town like Windham, it has nothing to do with how much money we collect. It's, again, the timing of when the tax rates are set and when the money is owed to the school. Basically, I have to pay the money to the school at the new school budget 6 months before I start collecting at the new tax rate. So there are a lot of intricate things in that would justify an approach which would decrease the amount of money moving in two directions, at different points in time. Thank you.
And just to get into the weeds a little bit with cash flow, towns and districts always have to manage their cash flow, of course, and really the town is in the driver's seat. Districts also have to manage their cash flow as well, of course, but the town and districts are working together on what is the disbursement schedule of the money they're raising through taxes, which is the primary source that funds school districts, and they're sending it to the school district. And so that's in disbursements. And I've seen excess swept legislation that you can either do a lump sum or you can do disbursements. But cash flow is definitely a consideration in either one of those scenarios. So I want to go through this handout. This one is just a hypothetical walkthrough of how excess swept would work if it was, if excess swept was remitted to the state. This is a hypothetical walkthrough of how it would impact a community. So under current law, all excess swept is retained. So if we have, under this hypothetical scenario, say we have a school budget of $2 million, $1 million is local education property taxes, $1 million is all swept, and let's say they retain excess swept of $250K. So under current law, it doesn't matter if it's excess or not excess swept, they retain all of it. So essentially, this is a very simplistic model here, but $2 million budget, half local funded, half state funded via swept. What would happen if overnight excess swept was remitted to the state? essentially, and we controlled. So they did not change their budget in any way, kept their budget flat. And what if no other revenue source came in? So again, it's a very simplistic model here. But if they had a $2 million budget and excess swept had to be remitted to the state, that community would continue to pay the $1 million in swept that they were paying all along. The only difference is now they don't get to keep $250K. And so that $250K now goes to the state. Now, if they want to continue to fund their school at $2 million in a budget, their local property taxes would have to increase by $250K. So now, if they took $250K out of their budget, that wouldn't be the case. But that's the assumption in this sort of simple model we're holding here. The reason why I'm mapping this out is because it is true that and I've heard people talk about this, multiple people talk about this, and it is true. It is true that you would be paying your excess swept to the state, and then you would also have to raise local property taxes at the same time. Yeah, so that is true that you're doing two things at once. However, it's important to remember the actual financial harm you're receiving as an excess swept community is only when the state decides you don't get to keep your excess swept. So you feel the financial harm once, even though there's these multiple transactions taking place where you're paying the state, you're raising your local property taxes. But when you see an analysis, and it's going to get tricky as you dive into this issue and potentially receive some bills from ed funding, it's going to get complicated. But whenever you're seeing what is the excess swept, you might intuitively think I need to double that to measure my financial harm, but that's not what you should be doing. You should be looking at the excess swept and go, okay, if I'm an excess swept community and this becomes the law via state law, via court order, et cetera, whatever is the excess swept, that is the financial harm. Again, we're assuming controlling for a lot of variables here, but that's the correct measurement, even though when you walk through the situation, it can get a little technical as far as you got to pay the state, then you got to pay your local school. Anyways, any questions about that?
Representative Murray?
Thank you. Can you explain? I thought you said they would. This is something that only experience once. Wouldn't it be once a year?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. No. Yeah. It would be once a year, but what talking this over, and I think Mickey and I were also scratching our heads because we heard someone say you'd have to pay it twice. And it's true that the transaction's occurring in multiple different methods, but your financial harm is measured once.
Thank you again. Can I just follow up? So one way of looking at this, from I guess my perspective where I live, you're asking school districts either to raise their taxes or to reduce the level of education that they're providing their students.
That's the effect of if you currently pay your swept. If you don't get to keep all of it, then the school district's taxes are going to go up. Or if you reduce your budget, then the taxes, local taxes would not go up.
So you're disincentivizing school districts from maintaining their education.
There's financial harm experienced. And then there's only two ways to deal with financial harm. Well, there's a couple different ways to deal with financial harm. You find other revenue, or you cut your budget, and that's the reality. And that's true with all of the school funding aspects.
Representative Popovich?
Thank you. I just wanted to build on what my colleague was saying and point out that for every dollar that a donor town is harmed by, there is a receiver town that benefits. So at the state level, whether we retain excess swept or not is a zero-sum game. At the end of the day, all that money goes toward educating kids somewhere, but we are essentially taking from certain communities and giving to others. The ones we take from suffer financial harm. The ones we give to suffer, enjoy financial benefits. And again, it's a zero-sum game, whether we redistribute swept or not. So just to make sure we are all on the same page on this. Yes, there is concern for the towns that are harmed, but that as state policy should be balanced by the fact that other towns benefit. So.
Yep. All I can say about the RAND order is if this can get more complicated because you can talk about what are you going to do with the $28 million. The RAND order just would say collect the $28 million. It wouldn't tell you how to spend it necessarily.
Yes, Representative Kelly.
Thank you. How does that affect a school district, a multiple town district?
Oh, like a cooperative?
Yeah.
Good question. Adequacy is cooperatives are unique. Inadequacy and SWEPT is somewhat unique how it deals with cooperative school districts. So a cooperative school district. So I don't know if do you have an example? Kearsarge. We'll use Kearsarge as an example. Is that 7 towns? Yeah. Okay, 7 towns. So the way Kearsarge works is essentially they have a budget for the Kearsarge School District. Kearsarge is nice and simple. It's not a split district. John Stark can get quirkier. But Kearsarge is 7 towns make up the 7-town school district. So Kearsarge has a budget. Let's say that budget is $30 million. That's their appropriations that they would like to do to fund a Kearsarge school district. Then there's revenue that is shared among the 7 towns. So special education aid, title funding, any tuition revenue coming in. There's a bunch of revenue that they would share. So essentially you have $30 million. Let's say you have shared revenue of $10 million. So now they've got that $30 million liability is now a $20 million liability because they've all shared that $10 million. Then what Kearsarge does is they apportion out that $20 million liability between those 7 towns. And I don't know if Kearsarge is half EV, half ADM, whatever their formula is, they're going to share that $20 million liability among those 7 towns. Then before those 7 towns get a tax bill, their adequacy in SWEPT, as shown up on this Muni sheet, is going to directly credit their tax liability. So if New London has a really favorable formula, they're going to get all the financial benefits of having a favorable formula. If, as a Wilmont doesn't, they're not going to receive the financial benefits. So each municipality doesn't share their adequacy grant with their peers within the cooperative. So you've got a $30 million budget, let's say $10 million shared revenue. You apportion out based on whatever the agreed upon apportionment formula is, and then you credit the adequacy and SWEPT grant for each community. So that's how that works. So whatever your town is that receives this grant, essentially it's your grant. It's not shared among your peers. But your title funding and other funding is shared among your peers. And that's just how cooperatives work. Any questions about SWEPT? Okay. So we stopped there on where the SWEPT is on the adequacy spreadsheet. Now we're going into the extraordinary needs grant. So for the formula for Alton, for excess SWEPT communities, the formula is essentially done. Alton but we'll keep going for Albany and Allenstown. So the next part of the formula is the extraordinary needs grant. So this grant is looking at the equalized valuation per FNR pupil. And so it's property over poverty, essentially, and it's becoming a metric. And so if you have a lot of property in your numerator and not a lot of poverty, not a lot of FNR students in your denominator, you would have a really high number. And so for Allenstown, even though Alton has a relatively high FNR population, looks like 20%, so a little bit below state average. They do have a lot of property. So when we do the property over poverty, the number is 36.4 million for Alton. But if you look at for Albany and Allenstown, it's much lower. And so the way this grant works is if your EV FRP, that metric, property over poverty, if it's higher than 6.866 million, you don't get the grant. Now, if it's under 1.664 million, meaning you have either low property or high poverty or both, or some sort of your relation between those two metrics is really low, produces a low number, which is true for Allenstown. If that number is under 1.6 million, you get equalized valuation, you get an extraordinary needs grant of $11,500 for each FNR pupil. So currently under this metric, under this estimate, no one is entitled to that $11,500 per FNR pupil. Berlin is close, but they don't hit it. I think Claremont's pretty close. Allenstown, somewhat close as well. So instead, you get a number between 11,500 and 0, depending on where you slide between 1.664 million and the 6.866 million of EV FRP measurement. So for Albany, they barely sort of squeak in. Their EVFRP is 6.7 million. So they're getting a really small grant per each F&R student. I don't know what the number is. It's probably a few dollars because they're really close to almost not being eligible because they're really close to that 6.866 million number. So their extraordinary needs grant is $8,557. Well, it's got to be more than a few dollars. It's got to be because it's produced 8,500 off 33 students. But they're close to not being eligible. Allenstown is on the lower end, so they're going to get a larger grant. So at that $2.6 million, if you took that 1.9 and divided it by 216, I can't do it in my head, but you would get what their extraordinary needs grant per pupil is. So they're going to get a higher amount than Albany. And so that's the extraordinary needs grant. It's targeted for communities that have high poverty and low property as measured together as a ratio, essentially. This grant in fiscal year 26, the max amount is now $11,500. In fiscal year 25, it was $8,670. So in state law, it got a boost. So a lot of communities did see a big boost in this number under the extraordinary needs grant. Before I keep going, any extraordinary needs grant questions? Okay. So that is targeted aid. That keeps going. So Albany and Allenstown get it. Alton does not because they're over the metric. The next grant is the Hold Harmless grant. So the way fiscal year 26 works is whatever the Hold Harmless grant in 25 was, is going to be your Hold Harmless grant in 26. However, it's going to be 80% of that. So the way fiscal year 25 and the way fiscal 24 worked was essentially we ran the formula as you see it. And if whatever we ran for the formula was less than 104% of the fiscal year 24 estimate that we made prior to the budget changing, you were guaranteed to receive at least that much state cash, really. So that's how the Hold Harmless worked in 24 and 25. So a lot of communities, if you look at your 24, 25 grant, if you're a Hold Harmless community, you just received the same money in 25 as you did in 24 because you were basically held harmless. Even though the formula was not working out in favor, in your favor. It was not working as well as it did under the old formula before major changes were made in fiscal year 24. It was not working out better for you. And the reason why you're a Hold Harmless community is likely because the change in fiscal year 24 was base aid was increased, F&R differential aid was increased, and the extraordinary needs grant was increased dramatically. But at the same time, stabilization grants went away. And stabilization grants is a Hold Harmless grant from 2012. So back in 2011, they were making changes to the formula for 2012, and it was going to result in some communities receiving less money in 2012 than they did in 2011. And so what the state decided to do was spend $158 million to ensure that no community received less money in 2012 than they did in 2011. And that was called stabilization grants. There's a long history of stabilization grants. They existed untouched for several years until 2017. There was efforts to reduce them. Then in 2020, they were fully restored. Now in 2024, they were taken away completely, but a lot of different other boosts were given to the formula. So when you factor in all the other boosts in the formula, that helped out a lot of communities. Some communities were not fully made whole by the loss in stabilization. So essentially the new stabilization, which we called Hold Harmless, is now $59 million. So that's, yeah, a lot cheaper than 158. Any questions about Hold Harmless? Yep.
Representative Popovich?
Thank you. I just wanted to state that it's not cheaper overall. It's cheaper as that sole element of the formula because at the end of the day, we pumped money in a bunch of different other parts of the formula. And overall, last budget cycle, we increased overall education spending by 193 million with student population dropping. So absolutely agreed that one element of the formula was reduced, fortunately, but there were plenty of others that made it a very positive gain overall.
That's correct. Above and beyond existing state aid went up substantially during that same year in which the hold harmless was put into effect. It is very common, hold harmlesses. They exist obviously in New Hampshire. Other state formulas use hold harmless. It's a very common tool. Of course, it's no one likes to have their funding reduced. So hold harmlesses are, you see them in other states as well. Usually a policy objective is to keep it as low as possible. So that's something people aim for. So yeah, whenever you see a hold harmless, sometimes it's considered, is the formula working or not? But way to think about it.
Representative Hacken Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just wondering, Mark, can you remind me how long the tail is for the hold harmless grants?
Oh, good question. Yeah, the hold harmless is now sort of set in stone and determined in 25, this fiscal year right now. The data is going to shift a little bit. Well, we've been talking with some school districts, tinkering with the data just a tiny bit, a student here or there. But once we finalize the fiscal year 25 adequacy, which will be the April 1st payment, that's now the hold harmless grant that is frozen. Right now, we estimate it to be 59 million. It's going to stay around that amount. Then in fiscal year 26, we're reducing it by 20%. So it's going to be 80% of that 25 number. Fiscal year 27, it's going to be 80% of that number. Then in fiscal year 28, it's going to be 60%. And so it's going to reduce, essentially it lasts for 10 years. So every 2 years, there's a 20% reduction. So it's going to last, the first reduction is in fiscal year 26. And after we finish the 10-year period, the hold harmless grant will be 0. So it will slowly decrease over that period by 20% each, every other year. And so NHED has been going out and talking to communities and letting them know that they have a hold harmless grant and letting them know that it's going to go away, so that they can prepare for that. That's the end of the formula. So essentially you do cost of inadequate education, back out SWEPT. That gets you, we call it the preliminary grant sometimes. That gets you an amount. Add extraordinary needs grant, adds hold harmless grant. If you're eligible for that, that gets you your adequacy grant. So that's that second to last column is the adequacy grant. It's essentially the state cash from the state. But then when we talk about school funding, we combined adequacy and SWEPT. So that's the last column. So that's that $1 billion, 80 million. It's all state cash and it's all SWEPT. So that's it for adequacy, excess SWEPT conversations. We also have the packet. Is there anything else to discuss relative to school finance or adequacy? Yeah.
Got a brilliant group. I guess we'll just keep going.
All right. Oh, yeah. I'll just quickly go through the packet. Caitlin recommended this. There's actually a few kind of neat things, I want to show you in here. So the first one is the fiscal year 25, 26, 27 forecast.
Can you just mention page, you're in the education funding orientation, correct?
Yes, funding
Just
orientation.
Could you just mention page numbers as you go?
Yep. So page 2 is basically the Education Trust Fund estimates currently for what we think you're going to be working with. These are numbers to, of course, on February 15th, you're going to receive the budget from the governor. So you're going to have different numbers to work with potentially, depending on what the governor presents. But these are estimates for fiscal year 25, 26, 27 for the Education Trust Fund and the programs. And we're going to be talking about the biggest program, of course, is district adequacy. We're going to talk about charter schools in a second, EFAs, EFA phase out, multiple other programs that are funded by the Education Trust Fund.
And the building aid there, just to be clear, is the tail. What you show us 26 and 27?
Sorry, what was the question?
The building aid you show in 26 and 27 just represents the tail?
Correct. This number right here assumes no new building aid projects, and that's just the tail liability that you'd have to pay.
Does everybody understand that? Want to understand that? No. Why don't you explain that? Oh. Oh, okay. No, never mind.
And the tail almost is going away, so it's getting close. It's been going on for a while. So, Getting close to it's getting smaller each year. Yeah, we talk about building aid later. Page 3, this is a pie chart. You don't have the official ACFR out, the annual comprehensive financial report. This is just a pie chart of the Education Trust Fund revenue. It's unaudited, fiscal year 24. For you to sort of just see that business profits tax. It was pretty interesting. I looked at this historically. Business enterprise tax used to be a much larger piece of the pie. I think it was like 11% of just a few years ago. So now business profits tax is a larger piece of the pie. Statewide education property tax is a piece of the pie. And that's the mechanics of SWEPT is it's a journal entry. So the way to see it, well, the way you're seeing it on the ACFR and in the state financials is although no money left a district under current law, no money left a district and was sent to the state, we know that money was assessed by taxpayers, assessed against taxpayers, and we know that town tax collectors sent it to their school district. So the state is recording on our books as a journal entry that 363 million was raised. So we'll book that as revenue, even though no cash came into our bank. And then we booked $363 million went out from the state. And so sometimes it can get a little confusing when you're reading a fiscal note. What's going on with the SWEPT? It's basically accounting. It's just a journal entry. Obviously, if the RAND order comes out, whatever may happen, if excess SWEPT becomes the policy of the state, could have changed things a little bit. But still, it's still going to be just a journal entry for the most part. I always get this. You might get this from your voters. They always talk about lottery. I get the question all the time. Hey, didn't lottery solve school funding? Didn't bring in all the money? So lottery does great for us. 17% of the Education Trust Fund. It's really performing super well with 200 million. But sometimes you'll talk to someone and they think it funds the full billion. It does not. And then there's some other revenue sources that come into the Education Trust Fund. This document's page 4. Sorry, it's a little cut off at the bottom. This document's already pretty outdated. This is just an LBA surplus statement. Throughout the month of March, Mickey's going to be running a lot of these for you, and just keeping tabs of the Education Trust Fund. And you'll get revenue numbers coming out monthly that are going to change the dynamics of this if the revenue numbers don't hit. So that is an Education Trust Fund surplus statement.
Hang on a second, Mark. Mickey?
So, like Mark said, this document will end up looking pretty familiar to you as we work through this session. We'll have one like this for also the Highway Fund and the Fish and Game Fund. It's a surplus statement, we call it. So this is a good big picture of the Education Trust Fund, especially for the new members. You can see all the revenue up top, all the programs that are funded down below. So we will get those revenue estimates from House Ways and Means at some point, hopefully within the next month, if not, hopefully on the sooner end. And then all of the appropriations down below, those are up to this committee to determine how much you want to fund each program at, what level you could. Some of the returning members will recall it. The Education Trust Fund never used to be this widespread for the number of programs it covers. It used to simply be adequacy, charter school adequacy, and the low and moderate income tax relief program at DRA. It's been expanded quite a bit because there was a lot of resources in the Education Trust Fund, but all of this is the prerogative of this committee, how you want to fund all these moving forward in your budget package. So I just wanted to make sure everyone understood this is an important document you'll see reoccurring in this committee for the next several weeks.
Does that make sense, everybody?
Page
This is
5.
as a result of what the Senate did. It didn't have all these things listed when it left us 2 years ago.
2 years, if you recall, the House passed budget. I don't want to misspeak. I think it took out a ton of the programs and put them on the general funds and switched some of the allocations of the business tax revenue to be mostly in the general fund. The Senate did unwind those changes in its proposed budget, and that ultimately is what ended up passing. So that is correct what Representative Weiler just described.
That's the surplus statement. Page 5 is basically the one pager on adequacy. You've just got that presentation. Page 6 through the few next pages, It shows you fiscal year 25 compared to fiscal year 26. I've been sharing this information with the districts because I want districts to know if their funding is decreasing and it's likely caused to the hold harmless going away. I wanted them to be aware so they can prepare for that. But the way you'll always receive, going forward, the way you'll always receive analysis is it's always going to be what is current law, so I mean you do nothing, and then what is the proposed policy. So you'll be seeing that in fiscal notes. You've already been seeing that in fiscal notes. But any analysis moving forward, that's the standard at which we do analysis on this. This is just unique analysis, so don't expect to receive this analysis moving forward. You'll always see proposed policy versus current law. Page 12 is the adequacy history document. It's got some of the changes throughout the years. Adequacy had changed pretty much for 5 straight years. It changed every year. Fiscal year 25, almost no change except for that home education piece. But I'm not going to count it. I'm going to count it as a year without change. I guess I'll get into the, I don't know if I want to get into the weeds with this, but you can change adequacy anytime you want via state law. However, if you ever change districts are right now working on their 26 budget. So if you change adequacy, they're not going to be able to adapt their budgets in any way to it. They have processes in place to do special district meetings. However, if you change adequacy every single year, it's just a revenue change for the district. Just something to be mindful of. Sometimes previous committees have decided to always change it in the year. We'll give them 1 year to adjust to it. You under state law can change it whenever you want. But that's just something to think about.
Representative Weiler.
The problem with what the Senate did, putting all these things into adequacy, was that we ended up with 129 million in surplus education trust fund that couldn't be used anywhere else in the second year, when there were other things that we would have liked to have funded. But the era of the Senate and putting all this stuff in adequacy meant that everything was tied up in education trust funds. So I don't think we want to repeat that again.
Page 13 is just a breakdown of fiscal year 24 and 2020. And this is, you can look at the expenditure side of it to see where there's growth in expenditures or where the expenditures are taking place. We're using 2020 as sort of the pre-COVID year, even though the last couple months were COVID impacted. Fiscal year 24, obviously the current latest data we have. Only thing pointing out is there's a lot of federal money that went out to school districts. That money is in the process of expiring, but you'll see that in the data. All the additional federal money has increased expenditures for school districts because they've received the money, spending the money.
Is there a reason Newfound is excluded?
They did not provide a financial report. It's a long story, but
Okay.
they had hopefully we'll get that soon. Page 14. This is looking at 23, 24. Page 15 is cost per pupil. This is something we publish on our website. You hear talked about a lot. Important to know that cost per pupil, it's current expenditures. So it doesn't include debt service, doesn't include capital expenditures. It's current operating expenditures. There are some other exclusions in there. And it's over the students being educated in that school. So Albany does not educate any students, so they don't have a cost per pupil because this is meant to measure the cost of educating a student at a school that you're operating, and Albany doesn't operate a school. So cost per pupil, just a common data point or metric you'll see in the area in school finance space. Page 19 is equalized valuation over ADMR. If you ever hear the term fiscal capacity disparity aid, instead of looking at property values over FNR students, fiscal capacity disparity aid is a formula, a concept that has existed in the state for a while now, and when it gets discussed a lot, and that's the concept of not focusing on FNR students, but focusing on all property over all students. And so that's measured as equalized valuation per pupil. And so you might hear that, the House's passed bills recently that the Senate did not agree with, relative to that concept. All right, page 26 is my favorite data point. A lot of you like to look at your tax rate, and you have a lot of feelings about your tax rate, wherever they may be, but and then you want to look at your neighbor's tax rate. And so you can't do that accurately. You can't look at your tax rate and your neighbor meaning a neighboring town, and say, oh man, that town's got it so nice. They might have it nice, but you don't want to look at the tax rate that they pay, because that is based on the assessed valuation, and you don't know how that town's assessing practices. So you want to look at an equalized tax rate. So this controls that if you had one town that was assessing every year, it would make it look like the properties would be keeping up with market value, and therefore the tax rate would be pretty low. But if you had a town that was really slow to assess, and they weren't assessing that often, but costs were going up, the tax rate would look really high. And so you would think that community is paying more than you, but really they're just not assessing as often. So the tax rate looks really high because they're slow to assess. And then one community, the tax rate, you think you have a really low tax rate, but really you're just assessing so much. And so the only way to control, or the best way to control for that, is to look at an equalized tax rate. And so this provides a more apples to apples comparison. There's so much that goes into taxes, revenue, expenditures. But when you can control for assessing practices, you can actually see, if you're getting a good deal to some extent. Really, you're only controlling for assessing practices. But that's the way to analyze your tax rate and compare it to your peers, looking at that equalized rate. Okay, we're moving along here. Page 32 is just enrollment participation by all the different entities that exist. So we have non-public enrollment. We talked about it at orientation. The home education data is not super reliable. The district public school data, it comes in. We have something called a SACID. That is basically, it's like a student social security number, essentially. It's a unique number that comes in for each student. So we have data controls on the student data that's coming in to make sure they're not duplicating a student because they have this unique identifier. We have data controls for charter schools. We have data controls for EFA students. The SACID is the data control. The other aspects are surveys, and so they're less controlled data collections. It's the data we have, so it's the data you kind of have to use because there's no other data that I can provide you. This is where you can look at basically where the students are being educated, with most of the students being in the district system.
So there seems to be quite a jumping around, like from 15, 16, then drops down dramatically and then starts to spike back up again. Can you, especially the 15, 16 and 16, 17, is there a reason for that? I'm looking at the total number down there, 6,000 down to 2,700.
Yeah.
So the way that homeschool students are reported to the Department of Education changed. So homeschoolers used to have to register. Since I've been told this, I wasn't there. I wasn't working on this program at the time. But all homeschoolers used to have to register with the state or their local district annually. So there was more reporting requirements, and then that was changed. So students only needed to register once in their lifetime. So we could stop reporting, stop collecting that information. The department then chose to at least collect from the schools the number of new registrants every year. So the number that we're reporting right now is actually the number of new registrants we're getting every year rather than the number of children that are annually accessing homeschooling.
Okay, so these numbers only represent new people coming in at that.
To our knowledge, so like Mark said, use the data with a grain of salt because there are still many parents that register every single year and the district might not know that. Also, if a child were to move around, there's some ambiguity whether they need to register with each district they live in. So they might register once in their educational career. They might be registering every year. There's still probably some confusion with students receiving an EFA, whether they need to register with their district or not. So we do know that at times students have tried to register with their district, even though that's not required if you're accessing the EFA program. And because we don't have any unique student data, as Mark just mentioned, we can't really do any reconciliation on that number.
Thank you.
In a concept in education, it's somewhat intuitive. Kids need to go to school, or kids need to get an education. the way, just an area that it's helpful to think about this is it's called the compulsory attendance law. And so students need to be in an educational system once they turn 6. So they need to either be in their district school, a public charter school, a non-public school, a home education program, or an EFA program. So those are all the different ways in which a student can receive an education that's compliant with state law in New Hampshire. And so some of those students are home educated, non-public, et cetera. Lastly, this is just federal funding on page 33, and that's allocations out there. These are kind of our standard allocations, so they don't include all the additional COVID money that's the state has been spending over the past few years. It was allocated out multiple years ago. That is federal funding. That's the packet. So, any questions?
Representative Murray.
Thank you again. Just so I'm really clear on the part of the packet that has, 300 pages, so I say page 30, pick any of them. The towns that are listed in the, I guess, the fourth column from the left, those are the towns that are included in the cooperative district.
Right.
And so a place like Rye sends their students to Portsmouth for high school, that's treated as tuitioning.
Yes.
Thank you. Just.
Yep, and we talk. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to structure your school. You can be a standalone school district that doesn't operate a school, or you can be, you can be a town that's part of a cooperative. Multiple different complexities. We can get into that if we'd like to, but maybe save it for another day. All right, thank you.
So before you go, so just this that federal page, it's about $140 million a year roughly that would be getting this year in federal aid. Is that how to read that?
Yep. Yes. With the biggest one being the title programs, which is up top. That's our largest funding source, and then IDEA, which is the special education grants to schools. That's the second largest, or that's actually is the largest funding source in the federal funding.
Thank you. So that's what the grants to states that are under subtotal, that's the IDEA?
Yep. Special education grants.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Welcome.
Do you want me to take you through those federal programs real quick and tell you what each one does?
Sure.
Since we're here, just back to that packet. What page was that one on?
Last page.
It's the last page.
33.
This may be useful information going forward. So, because there's obviously a lot of conversations about what's going to happen with the federal money and whatnot. So the bulk of the federal money that's coming into education in New Hampshire are these programs right here. Bulk of the K-12 education funding. There's plenty of higher ed funding and other funding. But so on the first line that you have Title I. So everybody knows the term Title I, but it's helping educationally disadvantaged students. So typically students in poverty, is a formula that's in federal law that provides additional funds based on your free and reduced lunch percentages and your total overall enrollments, but it's heavily weighted on your free and reduced lunch percentages. There's also some set asides in that for low performing schools. So the bottom 5% of schools are known as CSI schools, comprehensive support and improvement schools. And so there's a set aside in that goes to those schools. Migrant is exactly what it looks like. It's funding that is provided to provide educational supports for migrant students in the state. Neglected and delinquent is there's funding that helps students in like group homes in New Hampshire. There's also a set aside in Title I that supports those kids too. Supporting effective instructional state grants, that's known as Title.
Back to the migrant line. Who gets included there?
So students that are considered migrant students in the state, and the definition I think is you have to be working on agricultural programs, and these are typically students that are working on farms. We see a lot of them, or their parents are working on farms, like at apple orchards and whatnot in the fall, and so they're a more transient population. And I believe these funds can be used providing tutoring services directly to the students where they are living.
And do you track them by year in terms of numbers?
We do, yes.
And can we get that information?
We can, yes.
Thanks.
So the next one's supporting effective instruction. So that's known as Title IIA. That's a term that we all call it. It's essentially professional development funding for school that are used to support teachers in schools. It can be used for some class size reduction as well, but the majority of it is instructional support or professional development. 21st Century Learning Centers is before and after school programs. Again, it's heavily weighted on free and reduced lunch numbers. State assessments is exactly what it sounds like. It provides supports for the state assessment required under ESEA. Rural and low-income schools is funding that is dispersed to rural or low-income schools around the state. It is very flexible as far as the supports, but you can see there's not a ton of money, so it doesn't go very far. Same with the Rural School Achievement Program, that's is known as REAP. That actually weirdly doesn't flow through the Department of Education. I guess one of the things I should explain is the majority of this funding that you see right here is flowing directly from the U.S. Department of Education to the New Hampshire Department of Education. The New Hampshire Department of Education then calculates what each district is entitled to based on a formula that's in federal law and then disperses those funds.
Go ahead.
We have a pretty comprehensive grant management system and process that we're required to follow, including monthly drawdowns of funding. We review to make sure the activities that schools are spending the funding on are allowable under these different grants. And then we have a lot of compliance requirements around these grants.
So just to make sure I understand this, because I was going through some of these RSAs. If you look at the State Board of Education RSAs, they make reference to the fact that that's where all the federal funding flows into some account. Is that the same thing as you're saying, the Department of Education, or is it really something else going on?
So one of my other bills I've been very passionate about over the years is recodifying the education laws, because there are a lot of areas where the thing like Commissioner of Education and Department of Education, or Department of Education and State Board of Education, are used interchangeably, and there's definitely a lack of clarity, and that's one of those things. So all of these grants right here, with the exception of the REAP one, the Rural School Achievement Program, all has a separate accounting unit in the Department of Education budget, and you're seeing those funds, and those will be part of our bigger overall budget. So when you see that we have, I think it's like $200 or $300 million of federal funding in the department budget, that includes these monies as well.
Have you made any progress on because I know a couple of years ago we looked at trying to do the whole thing, and that was just like out of control. Have you made any progress with little bits and pieces we might like plug in here and there?
So, I mean, we are always working on different pieces, where we tried to rewrite, say, the accountability law last year. We got some pushback on that. We have some other pieces of data on the data comprehensive piece that we should do. Those are not to be done in a budget year. We don't have the time to do that in a budget year.
Maybe next year.
There is a bill, once again, to allow the department to do that. I think with Division 2, we had actually come up with a really good plan, which was require the department to release an RFP, come to fiscal with the results of that RFP, and then fiscal could decide if they wanted to fund that. Unfortunately, that's ultimately not what got passed, and there was another bill that got killed in the Senate, and so it's
So just let it go.
yeah. Well, no, we should still do it. It's very important, because there's a lot of questions that you just asked that really do need to be clarified. I mean, and there's just other sections of law, when we're talking about the student identifier, for example, there's a section of law that establishes our system that we use for that, and then other information that can be attached to that, and it's spread throughout all of those education laws, and it really needs to be put in one place so we really have a comprehensive understanding that can be done with that. So,
And it does require the legislature. It's not something you can do in rules in most cases.
no, it's for sure the law. The
Okay.
rules would need to be updated after, but it is the law is just,
So maybe next year we can at least get a little piece of it instead of trying to shoot for the moon.
yeah, I think that would be a great thing to talk about. So.
Yes, Susan. Representative DeRoy. Sorry.
I'm not so familiar with the grants for schools. Does it all go through you, or can the individual schools go for federal grants as well?
So there are sometimes federal grants that a federal agency may release that would go, that they could apply to directly, but these funds all go through us and they're required to. So we're known as a flow-through agency or an SEA, a state education agency, and in the law that establishes many of these, so the ones that we're talking about right now are all established in the Every Student Succeeds law. It requires the funding to go to the SEA, us, and then us to distribute the money to an LEA, the local education agency.
So if they go directly to the federal agencies for grants, the individual schools, do they report that to you? If they go outside of this program and there's a grant out there?
So it would be reported on the DOE 25 if it's a federal expenditure, because they're required to report all expenditures at the school district level. So another example of a grant, so the Department of Energy recently had grants for school districts for energy efficiency projects, and that doesn't go through us. But if a school district were making those expenditures, they would need to be reported on the DOE 25 to us. Okay. So when we're looking at the total spending, when you're looking at local, state, and other spending, all federal funding and all local spending, regardless of who's giving it to the school, should be reported on the DOE 25. All right, so it's small rural education achievement program again. So that goes directly to the schools. Student academic supports and enrichment grants, that's known as Title 4B. That is really used for technology supports at schools. English language acquisition, that's known as Title III. Those are for students that have limited English language proficiency, and those funds go to support school districts providing services to those children. Homeless children and youth, it is exactly what it sounds like. It's to provide school supports to school districts that have homeless children. And then, so those are the ESEA, the Every Student Succeeds Act grants. Those were previously known as No Child Left Behind. When it was reauthorized, it was the Every Student Succeeds Act. It is the part of the larger Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was the original Education Act.
Which one was that you were referring
So
to?
all of the ones I just talked about.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So starting to three. So then the next thing, so you have the Individuals with Disability in Education Act, that's known as IDEA, or special education. And so there's 3 grants totaling about $61 million that New Hampshire is entitled to. You have the largest grant, the $56 million grant, and the preschool grant, the 1.7. Those flow through the Department of Education. The grants for infants and families actually go through HHS here in New Hampshire, just kind of delineate that.
Which does?
The grants for infants and families,
Thank you.
but the rest of that goes through the Department of Education. And then career and tech education grants, or otherwise known as the Carl D. Perkins grant, and those are to provide funding to school districts that have a career and a tech education program. Those are the large federal grants that are flowing through us. There are other grants that we receive at the Department of Education. Those usually are federal discretionary grants that we may apply for directly to the U.S. Department of Education. The one that I can think of most recently, or not most recently, but one we were successful in receiving, we received the charter school grant, the $46 million charter school grant. That was a discretionary grant that the Department of Education applied for. We were actually required to apply for it in state law, but there was no requirement for us to apply for it in federal law. So we applied it and we're successful. We've also applied for 2 SLDS, Student Longitudinal Data Systems grants, and those are just supplemental funds that help us improve our education reporting systems.
So all those you just rattled off come under the career and technical?
No. Those are completely separate. They're just, so these are the ones that the Department of Education typically gets on a very regular basis that are because of federal acts that allocate funding to the state. This is out of a federal budget. This is not out of the Department of Education budget. So when you're looking at the Department of Education budget as a whole, you'll see those other grants, but this right here is just for the purpose of talking about the formula grants one of the things that we've been talking about lately in the news is when you're talking about formula grants to states, block grants to states instead of formula grants. These are likely the ones that would become block grants rather than formula grants.
So the Career and Technical Education State Grants, does that have any relationship to CCSNH?
I do actually believe there's a set aside that goes to CCSNH. Melissa White will be here on Wednesday and can you actually write that down? We'll be able to clarify that for you, but I think there is a small set aside that's supposed to help tech ed programs.
Okay. And what would the rest of it be going toward?
Public schools that have a career and tech education center. So like here in Concord, we have the Concord Regional Tech. So we have in New Hampshire, we have regional career and tech education centers. We have a regional model. So
High school level.
high school level, yes. Yeah, K through 12, which the state as a whole determined was the best way of having career and tech education in the 70s. And so that helps have higher quality programs, reduces duplication, and provides or increases statewide availability to students that may live in a more rural community who that community itself couldn't necessarily support a career and tech education program. So because we have this regional tuition model, it helps increase access. So we'll talk about that. So the federal funding is specifically to support the programs, and then we have state funding too called Career and Tech Ed Tuition and Transportation, which helps those school districts that are sending those kids to a district that's not theirs with supports for the transportation costs and the tuition costs of those
Thank you.
kids.
And I would see that in the budget.
Yes, you'll see that in the budget.
Thank you.
So I just wanted, that was just a kind of brief overview of those federal funds. I know we're getting a lot of questions about those, so. So next up, we're going to talk about charter schools, and Brian Eaton is going to take over and talk about charter school funding.
Great. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Brian Eaton. I also work in the Bureau of School Finance. So this is a quick packet. This won't go too long. This is just to provide some insight to how charters are funded. This is specifically state aid. So Caitlin just mentioned there's a charter grant. That's a federal grant for startup of charters. This is what we're talking about is strictly just state aid, similar to what we talked about earlier with market adequacy. So page 2 might look familiar. So it is a what we call one pager on charter public school funding. And so the majority of these rates will look familiar because these are the rates that are followed for district adequacy, those adequacy rates Mark just mentioned before. There's slight variations. We'll go through and describe those. So it's very top row there. That is the base adequacy aid for all students based on ADM calculation throughout the whole year. That is $4,265.64. Another thing another differentiation between this and adequacy is that this is paid the year the student is enrolled. So with adequacy, there's 1 year lag. Charter aid is paid the year. So we're in fiscal year 25, also school year 25. Those students are paid throughout the year in iterations through 4 payments. The charters are paid the same year the students attend. Next row will be F&R. Again, we talked about that. Those are students eligible for free and reduced lunch price meals, and that is the same rate as you would see in adequacy. Next row is special education, same rate. The difference is also with special education is that it is paid to the district of responsibility. So the amount of aid that would be for a charter school, for example, students that are identified as special education attending that charter school, the aid is actually going to the town those students reside in, and then the town or school district would work with the charter school on an MOU or tuition agreement in order to actually work through if the child's receiving those services there. They might not be, so that's something that the charter school and the district or town would work together with to coordinate those services. And that is in law because the town responsibility is responsible for coordinating those services, responsible for those services, special education. Next row would be English language learner. Again, similar to district adequacy, that is the rate also in district adequacy. And each one of those, we mentioned earlier, increasing 2% each year through current law. So that breaks down each aid component for a charter aid. There's one additional, which is called the additional grant. And so it is different between VLAX, which is the Virtual Learning Academy Charter School, and non-VLAX. So for all intents and purposes, that can be sort of tacked on to the base aid. It's an additional grant rate for every student that attends that charter school. So on the bottom left, you'll see 2 blocks. One is additional grant for non-VLAX, and then one is for VLAX. So the non-VLAX would be $5,097.96. VLAX would be $2,445.15. So to the right of that, you'll see some some green blocks. And so you'll see that the additional grant is for the additional grant and the base for non-VLAX would come to that $9,363.60 figure in the bottom right. And then the base plus the differentiated, the base and the additional grant for VLAX would come to $6,710.79. So it's mostly the same as district adequacy. The only difference is being that there's an additional grant that tacks on to the base aid rate, as well as the slight differences with the special education, that aid being paid directly to the town responsibility, district responsibility. Everything else, all the other rates are paid to the charter school directly from the state. Any questions on that before moving forward? Great. The next 3 pages, again, mostly just reference documents. So this first one, which is page 3 of 5, that would be each charter school, which we follow on the left side going down for each row, and then the ADM for each charter school and where they fit into each one of those categories we just described, whether it's base aid, FNR, special education, ELL. So this is for FY24, the last fiscal year that we fully paid out. We're currently in fiscal year 25, so we won't know that until the final payment after school ends. And so this is fiscal year 24. And then you'll see those 4 categories that you'd see similar to district adequacy, and then you'll see the additional grant there, third from the right. So it breaks out each one, base, FNR, special education, ELL, and then the additional grant as well. And it also breaks out on the very right. It shows the second from the last is the total grant for students attending charter schools. The very right one would be the actual grant that the charter schools receive. So it backs out that special education aid because that's sent to the town district responsibility. So those are all charter schools in the fiscal year 24, and then each one of the grants that through state aid, as well as broken down each category. The next page would be 4 out of 5. That is more of a historical document, just explaining the rates in ADM for charter schools from FY 2017 to 2026. So working left to right is FY 17 to 26. Breaks down this first kind of top third of the sheet would be the rate for each type of ADM. So we have our ADM for kindergarten grades 1 through 12, which was different at one point in time. Now they're the same, treated the same rate. And then as you work down, FNR, special education, ELL. Mark mentioned there was a 3rd grade reading grant that was discontinued beginning FY24. And then each one of those additional grants. So that shows the trend and the differences and increases of each rate from 2017 to 2026 through current law for FY26. And then below that, the middle sort of bar there would be the ADMs for each one of those categories throughout those years. Again, with the percent increase and the change, you may see one kind of outlier, one sticking out would be FY22, well, really FY21, an increase of base ADM 963, and that was VLAX through pandemics. That was additional enrollment through VLAX. So there's a bump there, and then what shows as a decline in ADM is really just returning back to normal in a way between FY21 and 22, mostly VLAX students receiving the services through Virtual Learning Academy. And then the bottom bar there is the total cost of charter aid through each one of those categories through each fiscal year. So the total, and then breaking it down by each one of those categories as well. And the final page, again, just mostly reference document, would be every charter school that is currently open or has closed since from FY 2007 to currently the fiscal year 25. So working from the top left down would be all those charter schools. About most of the way down, you'll see closed charter schools. So those will include charter schools that were open at one time but have closed as of this fiscal year. They are no longer open. And then each one of the ADMs, this is just base ADM through each year. And then the very bottom is where you'll see VLAX. That's their full-time and full-time equivalent for students. If there's students that are attending charter VLAX part-time, but they're also attending their resident district full-time, those students are full-time equivalent. That's based on credits and percent complete that VLAX reports to us. So that's how we calculate to payment for them. So that's about it. Like I said, mostly this is all reference documents for charter schools, through the years. And that very first document will explain how it's funded in different categories, again, similar to district adequacy.
So I want to remind the committee that charter schools are authorized by the State Board of Education. They're nonprofits in the state of New Hampshire, and they have a local board of nonprofit board members that oversee the school, as opposed to a traditional public school district. So that's kind of the difference. And they provide some, but not all of, or they have to follow rather, some, but not all of the same requirements that district public schools have to require. So a good reminder too, as you're working through legislation, if there's something that you want to impact both charter schools and district public schools, you do need to say both. You need to actually call out charter schools, because otherwise charter schools are exempt if law does not specifically talk about a charter school.
And one more to add, just particular to funding. We've seen a couple bills come through so far. That's in-house funding, education funding, that if a legislator were to try and we're proposing a bill to increase district adequacy, the rates that we just described for charters are referenced as the same rates that are in district adequacy. So if you are changing one, it has kind of a trickle effect, waterfall effect. So when there's rates being changed, it will affect not just district adequacy, but also charter adequacy as well.
So in the rates case, we don't need to make that special, we don't have to refer to both. Is that
No,
what you're saying?
unless you don't want it to impact
Yeah,
both, but
right,
it will automatically impact both. So the way it works, so charter schools fall under RSA 194B, but that refers back to RSA 198, which is the adequacy law. The same for education freedom accounts, which we'll talk about in a moment.
Representative DeRoy?
Just a quick question on specialized schools like the Monarch School of New England down in Rochester. How does that work into all of these numbers? Because I know you're funding that as well, right?
That's
So-
a non-public school, so they have agreements with the districts. So the districts pay the non-public school to provide those services. If a district's educating a special education student, they're going to receive special education differential aid. If it's a high-cost special education student, they might receive special education, formerly known as catastrophic aid. And so the district would receive that money, but then they would be paying the Monarch school.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
yeah, so we have a variety of non-public schools in the state, and some of them are approved just through the State Board of Education to provide general education services. And then some of them are, in addition to that approval from the State Board of Education, seek an additional approval from our special education office. Then we'll approve them to provide special education services. And so then if they are being provided funding, everything goes through the district. The district looks at a child's IEP and says these are the child's disabilities, and I think this non-public school, which is approved, can provide those supports and will place the child there. And then through the placement, the district is reimbursed through the regular process, and we don't have any direct reimbursement through the Monarch School or any other non-public school.
Okay, great, thank you.
Representative Murray?
Thank you. I'm just curious, and I may have seen this and forgotten. Can you just give a brief breakdown of the schools? How many are K through 12? How many focus on elementary, the middle school? How many are in the high school?
I don't have that today, but I can certainly bring that back for Wednesday.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Landrigan?
Brian, can you just let the committee know how you came up with the fiscal 26 and 27 estimates for charter schools? Does that assume enrollment growth, new schools coming on board? How were those numbers derived?
Sure, great, thank you. Yes, so the easy one would be new schools that are estimated to open FY26. That would include our estimates, our best guess estimates, working with the school, and maybe Kim can describe that better. It does also include, like you just mentioned, trends. So between what we currently have for FY25 for enrollment for each charter school, as well as what they reported for FY24. And that holds true, similar how we treat district estimates as well. So our estimates for FY26 are using trends based on enrollment current year compared to historical trends, and then including schools that are to open as well.
I do think it's important to remind the committee too that we have that grant that I mentioned, that $46 million grant. That grant is specifically for opening new and increasing existing charter schools, or expanding, existing charter schools. So the Department of Education is in the tail end of that grant, meaning that we are providing funds to groups that would like to start new charter schools. Allowable use of funds is a pretty rigorous process. And then once the school's open, they're not really entitled to any more startup grants. That's when they go into just the regular formula. Charter schools, in a time where we wouldn't have a grant, there will be less charter schools opening.
Representative Popovich?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and again, thank you for your patience this afternoon. I asked a similar question in education funding in regards to the kids who are taking ESL, who are categorized as English as a second language. I wanted to repeat the question here so everybody's aware of the discussion, right? That I'm trying to understand how many years should a child be in an ESL program before they are supposed to know English and no longer be an ESL kid? And in addition to what we were talking about a few days ago, I wanted to know if the department has information indicating how many years does a kid spend in an ESL program. Do you just get totals? Are you told that a specific student is in that program? Just I want to understand what you guys have, and again, what you feedback you can provide on the appropriate amount of time for a child who comes in as English as a second language to become proficient in English and no longer require those services. Thank you.
Sure. So we do have a person at the Department of Education paid through by one of those federal grants, the English Language Learner Grant, who specializes in this area. So I can see if they're available for our presentation on Wednesday. If not, I believe Melissa, the director, might be able to provide more information. As far as your questions about the data, though, so when we collect information on a student, a school will specify if a student is an English language learner student, and that means one, we will know how they're performing on the English language learner assessment, because there's an assessment specifically to gauge a student's understanding of the English language, and then also if the student is receiving additional supports around them being an English language learner. So we have that information on the student when we collect that information, but as far as how many years, I don't have that information.
Thank you. Given that you guys seem to have that information on individual student level, would it be possible to have a summary analysis, not by individual, obviously, but, out of the kids in the ESL program, so many of them are in their first year here, so many of them are in the second year and so on. Again, if you aggregate it at the state level, there shouldn't be any privacy concerns. And all I'm looking for is total statewide, nothing district specific. Thank you.
Any other charters stuff before we switch topics? All right, we'll switch to EFAs. Yep. Okay. One more packet for you. Nope, he's got it. All right, last up for today, we're going to talk about education freedom accounts, or EFAs. In other states, they are known as education savings accounts. That's kind of the national terminology, or some states have a voucher type program, but in New Hampshire, we call them education freedom accounts. So education freedom accounts are a funding that allows parents to provide, or provides funding to parents to make educational choices for their children outside of a resident district school or a public charter school. The way the funding formula works is very similar to the same way the funding formula works for the other two programs we've talked about today. So when you look at page 2 on your packet, you're going to see some numbers that look very familiar because just like the charter schools, the education freedom account numbers are based on the RSA 198 adequacy numbers, and there are no additional differentials that are on the education freedom account program. So the way it works in New Hampshire, a little high level, is so the law, which was passed in HB 2 in 2021, established the program starting in fiscal year 22. The program right now is in its 4th year of operation, and it provides funds or requires the Department of Education to provide the funds to a scholarship organization, and then the scholarship organization is required to determine students eligible for these funds and then distribute these funds into a digital wallet. The state law actually requires use of a digital wallet system that then the parents can access these funds to pay for educational expenses associated with the child. So this means that the Department of Education collects data from the scholarship organization in the same way that we do from traditional public schools. We collect student level, SACID level data. We do a calculation to see how much that child should receive, if they should receive a base amount, a free and reduced lunch amount, a special education amount, or an English language learner amount. And then it's dispersed 4 times throughout the year to the scholarship organization. The scholarship organization is allowed to keep up to 10% off the top for administration of the accounts, and the remaining funds go into the digital wallet. So the amounts that we're talking about today, so just like we talked about before, $4,265 for every kid is the base amount. $2,392 is the amount for a free and reduced lunch. $2,184 is the special education amount, and $832 is the amount for an English language learner student. And on that page also you have the disbursement schedule, so we disperse it throughout the year 4 times based on counts, just like we do with district public schools and charter public schools. Similar to charter schools, EFA accounts are paid in real time too. So remember, district schools are paid 1 year in arrears. Charter schools and education freedom accounts are paid in the current year. So the next page in your packet is page number 3. It is a lot bigger than this ADM history that you've seen for the other programs, but that's just because it's very few years that have been in operation. So in 10 more years, the other one's going to be really small as well. But so you can see the kind of the trends that we've had. So you can see on line 6. So the first year of the program count on October 1st was 1,635 kids. The second year is 3,025. The third year, 4,211. And then as of this year, or our estimate for this year is 5,852. So those are kind of the numbers that we have, and then we kind of show you the total dollar amounts. So $8 million the first year, 14.6 the second, 22 in fiscal year 24, and this year we're anticipating the program to be $30 million. These funds are drawn from the Education Trust Fund as required by the Education Freedom Account Law, and it's also an allowable use of the Education Trust Fund under the law that establishes the Education Trust Fund. The next thing in your packet is just the towns and the counts from each town. So this looks obviously a lot like the adequacy spreadsheet that you saw before, but the funding does not go to the town. This just represents the resident town of the student. So flip through all of those pages. And that's current year too. So if you look at the very last column, we haven't made the April disbursement yet. So that one, that's why that's blank.
So is that tracking the amount that's still going to the town even though the student is gone?
No, this is the amount that's specifically dispersed to the scholarship organization for funding the child's EFA.
Thanks.
But next thing in your packet on page 9 is the phase out grant. So the phase out grant, when the legislature established this program, wanted to provide additional supports for school districts. Well, when a student left a public school district to take an EFA. And so in the very first year that a student accesses the EFA, because adequacy is paid 1 year in arrears, the school district has 100% of those adequacy funds still available to them. We in New Hampshire pay for the student where they attend the school. We've always been that way. So when we're talking about the ADMs for adequacy that Mark was talking about before, those only include kids enrolled in your public school. So if you had homeschoolers or non-public school kids, and I say non-public schools, we use the term non-public school in New Hampshire, not private school. Just remember that also when writing laws, because that can be tricky. But so non-public school kids, if those kids are in your town, you're not receiving adequacy for those kids. So when a student leaves a public school to take an EFA, once the kid is no longer there, then the public school would not receive any additional funds for that child. So the phase out grant was a grant that was implemented as part of this program to subsidize for the fact that the students are leaving, to allow the school districts to have time to account for the kids leaving. So in the very first year that there's no kid, they receive 100% of their aid because that is working in 1 year in arrears, regular adequacy. And the second year that the kid leaves, you get a grant of 50% of the adequacy that would be calculated for that student. And it's a very precise calculation. So if the student was an English language learner and a special education kid, you get that amount for that kid. If they were just an English, if they were just a base kid, then you get just the base amount. And we actually even account for, like, if the kid was in the public school half of the year, you would get half of that amount. Those, when you asked before, that 0.8 kid, it's being accounted for in this formula as well. And then the last year, you get 25%. And so it kind of creates layers for these kids. And so we, on the spreadsheet or the sheet here, you have the colors. The colors are really helpful because it kind of helps you follow the years that those kids would be getting, that the schools would be getting grants for those kids. And the phase out grant in law, it ends on July 1st, 2026. So that means that the kids that take an EFA for fiscal year 26, those are the last kids that would receive a phase out grant, and no additional phase out grants would be paid after that to public schools. And then the information in is actually, it's just a very long document, but it just kind of, it shows you the calculation, and it shows you which schools are actually, which kids have actually left, or which districts have actually left and they're receiving a phase out grant for those kids. So that's the information there. And again, you have a town by town in the packet, and that is it. Oh, and the last thing that I put on your packet is a document from the Children's Scholarship Foundation, but these are the poverty guidelines for eligibility for an Education Freedom Account. So the first year that the program passed, it was 300% of federal poverty, and then year 3 and 4 are 350% of federal poverty. So there's some questions, or there's some bill proposals to change it to 500% or other numbers, and so these kind of, I just put this there for informational purposes, so you would have this.
Any other questions? Representative Weiler.
Is there any example of an EFA student going from one district to another public school?
There are, yes. Not very many, but there are a few.
Is there a problem with that? They're bringing the EFA grant, but they're not bringing the same amount of money that the students are funded for.
Right, so just like a district public school could charge tuition to another district public school, the district public school could charge a tuition amount to the EFA student, and they can set that tuition amount. There's nothing in this law that requires them to set that tuition amount on a certain amount. So the student can use their EFA and then potentially additional funds that they have accessible to them as a family, if the tuition amount is higher than the amount of the EFA.
Thank you.
Representative Kelly.
Thank you. I have several questions.
Go right through them.
Okay. So, could you please walk us through how those EFA accounts work? You're referring to it as a wallet. Is that like a debit card, or how does that work?
That would be a question that would be better for the scholarship organization that implements the program. The department doesn't do that work directly.
Okay. So how would I ask that question of them? Just
I think
email it?
that would be the best thing, would be to email them directly.
Okay. All right, still have. I understand that the money in the EFA account is non-lapsing and it can roll over from year to year. So I'm wondering if there's a limit to how many years that lapse can continue.
So as long as the student is enrolled in the program, the funds can roll over. Once the kid finishes their education, the funding would come back to the Education Trust Fund, but it can roll over for the time that the student is in the program.
So that's possible to be sort of a 10-year, 12-year rollover?
In theory, if you weren't using any of the funds to educate the child, but you would think, if you're educating the kids, funding is coming from someplace.
Okay. Can the student or the family use the money for a college account? In other words, in here, in the RSAs, under 194F2, there's M, it says tuition and fees at an institution of higher education. So how does that work? If the student reaches age 18 or graduates, what does this line mean for higher education? Is that college?
So it's supposed to be for kids kindergarten through grades 12. As far as what isn't educationally appropriate for that student, the scholarship organization has the ability to determine that. So the scholarship organization may be able to tell you when they are or are not accessing that line.
So at the very end, when the student graduates, 18 or graduates, if there's any money left in the account,
Those
that-
funds are supposed to come back to the state. Yes.
so I suppose, can you tell me how that happens?
So the scholarship organization, we actually do a reconciliation process with the scholarship organization every year where we look at all of the kids that we disperse funds for. And we can see, for example, if the child left the education freedom account and went back to a public school, and that would show up on the public schools roster. And this is something that happens throughout the year, is a pretty intensive reconciliation process where we review the child. We would reduce any remaining account, or we would calculate the remaining account, and the scholarship organization would review that and reduce any remaining funds in the account and give them back to us for that appropriate period of time.
Okay, I think that's it for now.
Okay.
I have others, but I'll wait.
Go ahead if you,
Well, I'm not sure if you can answer this. I'm wondering about the Amazon account. We were told before that the family can access an Amazon account. I'm wondering if there's a list of books that are provided to the family or the student.
Yeah, that again would be a question for this scholarship organization. So I would remind you that the legislature has determined that the scholarship organization is the group that is responsible for implementing this program. The Department of Education's authority kind of ends with, I believe it says the Department of Education shall transfer to a scholarship organization an amount for the EFA. So the Department of Education has oversight relative to the contract, but as far as determining what is and isn't educationally appropriate for the student, that the legislature wrote the law so that is the responsibility of the scholarship organization.
Okay, thank you.
all set, or you still looking? Okay, Representative Popovich?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to make sure that, everybody on the committee is on the same page, would it be accurate to say that the only appropriate use of any funds in an EFA account is for the education of that child that the, account is in the name of?
Yes.
Thank you. And just to follow up on one of the questions from my colleague, did you see any meaningful amount of money being returned to you through that process where the student reaches the end of their K through 12 education and there is still unspent money in the account? Any color you can add to that?
I don't know off of the top of my head relative to students ending the program. I do know that there are a fair number of students that at the beginning of the year consider an EFA account and then throughout the course of the year return to public school. And so that reconciliation process, we are very confident in that reconciliation process, but there are a fair number of kids that do go back to their public school. And so then therefore the scholarship organization returns all those additional funds. And the way that works is that the public school reports to us the day that they return to public school, and then we calculate the amount of money that they would have received through that period of time.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, if I may suggest, given that there is interest in conversations with the scholarship organization, would it be possible to, maybe ask Mr. Landrigan to see if they would be willing to come in and talk to us at a later date so we can, get everything straight from the horse's mouth on tape and all that? Thank you.
Representative Murray?
Thank you very much. So there was a little hole in my brain. Can you connect sort of the dots to whom is the scholarship organization accountable? If they're not accountable to you, the Department of Education, to whom are they accountable?
So the scholarship organization is responsible for following all of the laws in RSA 194F, and there's a bunch of different things that the scholarship organization has to do within certain things, within certain time periods. So there's certain reporting that they have to do for the Department of Education. There's certain reporting that they have to do to the Department of Revenue because they're registered under 77G. There's certain requirements that they're required to do because they're a nonprofit to the Charitable Trust Unit at the Attorney General's office. And there's also reporting, there's a legislative oversight committee for the education freedom accounts that the scholarship organization attends. So there are a fair number of different things throughout RSA 194F and all the New Hampshire laws.
Thank you again. So some of us have been looking for some of these documents to see, what accountability proposals or, follow-ups that they're doing. And we're having a hard time finding this information. If we wanted to be able to examine the documents that support the accountability, how would we do that?
I would recommend talking to the Children's Scholarship Foundation. The documents that they're required to report to the Department of Education makes available, or the summary of the documents. A lot of the information they provide to the Department of Education is student identifiable information. So it's summarized, say, like in the town by town kind of calculations here, or our various different reconciliation processes. But the Children's Scholarship Foundation would be the best group for that.
The Legislative Oversight Committee also did file an annual report in November, so I can circulate that to the committee, so you've got that as well.
Any other questions? Any other comments?
That's all we had prepared for you today. You guys went through Mark's stuff very quick, just to be fair. On Wednesday, we'll be back. We are going to do, Kelly Rambo is our administrator of our food and nutrition program, and that's not any materials that you've received in the past from us. We didn't do anything on that on orientation day. So she's going to talk you through the federal and any state responsibilities around food and nutrition programs, and then some of the various different legislative proposals. Mark will be here too to discuss the impacts of the free and reduced lunch program on some of these other aid programs, because that's one of the things, we're seeing free and reduced lunch eligibility as the proxy for poverty here in education. But so if you're changing eligibility requirements on that side of things, it could impact some of these other programs. So we'll be here to talk about that. We will also have Tim Carney to talk about the building facilities program. He'll talk about building aid, lease aid, and SAFE grants, public school infrastructure grants. Mickey, did we have? Oh, we were talking about Jeff, right? Oh, special education. Melissa will be here to talk about special education. And we know there's a lot of proposed legislation and questions and concerns relative to the state special education formula specifically. So she'll be here to talk about that. And then we can have Jeff, but I don't know if we'll have time for him. Yeah, maybe Jeff on another day. But so the topics, and back to the packet, the one that says ETF district.
Before you get into
finance
that, who's the last
documents.
person you mumbled about there?
Oh, Jeff is the administrator of the Career and Tech Education Program. So
Does he speak a lot?
So we were just thinking with the number of programs ahead of that, it might be a lot for that afternoon. So if we don't get to tuition and transportation or CT programs, we'll make sure that the department can answer those questions when they come in with their budget hearing after the budget comes out.
and Melissa will be here. So I don't think we were going to have Jeff, but Melissa, who is the director of those bureaus, will be here, and we will be able to talk about it high level too.
It just might be helpful to get some oversight of that before we actually get into the budget, when we're going to be more focused on the numbers. So that's fine. If she can present it, that's totally fine. You don't need to bring a special person in.
I'll talk to her and Jeff and see what's
All right,
available.
thank you.
But so I was just going to remind you, so on the original packet here, the education funding orientation ones, the ETF. So this one is these are all the things that you're going to probably need to make decisions on relative to the department's budget. The department's the other things in our budget are, I'd say, immaterial compared to these programs, and these are the ones that the impacts go directly to school districts. You can see measurable impacts on your towns that you represent when you're looking at these programs. So these are the things that you're going to want to make decisions on that are going to be probably the harder decisions that you have to make throughout this budget process. And so we've covered the majority of them, but if there's something on here that you're seeing that we don't cover today and Wednesday, definitely let me know, and we can do that as well.
So is that the orientation one you were talking about?
Yeah, yep. The one that says ETF and school district finance documents. It's the larger one that Mark had.
No, wrong one. She names them differently in the.
I took the date off. Yeah, when I sent them digitally, I took the date off. Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Trying to recycle.
Your file names and your document names are different. That's
Oh,
all.
trying to recycle these as much as possible. You know, we're trying to have one thing so we can talk about it consistently throughout the year, so it helps us help you.
So essentially, we were referring to that page 2? One?
Yes, page 2.
Page
It just
one?
lists the big education trust fund items.
Okay, thank you. Anything else across the board here? No? Okay, thank you
Right.
very much.
Thank you.
Division 2 meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Landrigan.